Have you ever had someone call the police on you for standing on your own land? I mean, seriously, imagine waking up early, minding your own business, doing something peaceful, something you've done 100 times before, and suddenly someone storms up acting like you're the criminal. Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me. And the craziest part? The person who called the police on me thought she had the full power of an HOA behind her. But what she didn't know, what absolutely no one in that neighborhood realized yet, was that the land they were so confident about, it was mine. That morning started like any other Saturday. I woke up just before sunrise, the way I usually do on weekends. I've never been the type of person who enjoys sleeping late. There's something about early mornings that feels peaceful, like the world hasn't started rushing yet. The sky outside my window had that soft blue glow that comes right before the sun appears. Everything was quiet. No traffic, no lawnmowers, no barking dogs. Just silence. I pulled on my boots, grabbed a cup of coffee, and stepped outside. My orchard sat just beyond my small house, stretching across a few acres of land that had been in my family for decades. Rows of peach trees stood tall and steady, their branches slowly filling out as the season warmed up. That orchard wasn't just property. It was history. My grandfather planted the first trees there almost 60 years ago. Back then, the area looked completely different. No big houses, no neighborhoods, no perfectly trimmed lawns or fancy mailboxes. Just farmland, dirt roads, and wide open sky. When I was a kid, I spent nearly every summer there with him. He'd wake me up early, hand me a small shovel, and say something like, "Trees don't grow if you sleep all day." I didn't always enjoy the work back then, but now those mornings are some of my favorite memories. So every weekend, I still walk through the orchard. I check the soil, trim branches, make sure everything's healthy. It's almost like continuing a conversation my grandfather started years ago. That morning was no different. The grass was still wet with dew as I walked between the rows of trees. Birds were chirping above me, hopping from branch to branch like they owned the place. The air smelled like fresh dirt and peach blossoms. It was quiet, peaceful, perfect. I stopped near one of the older trees, the kind with a thick trunk that showed just how long it had been standing there. Its branches stretched wide, heavy with leaves. I knelt down and pressed my hand into the soil. Still moist. Good. I grabbed my watering hose and started spraying around the roots, watching the dirt darken as it absorbed the water. That's when I heard it. A car door slam. Not just a normal slam either. One of those loud, angry slams people make when they're already upset about something. I paused and glanced toward the dirt road that ran along the edge of the orchard. A shiny white SUV had just pulled up near the fence line. The kind of car that looked like it had never touched a speck of dust in its life. The driver's door swung open, and out stepped a woman who looked like she was already halfway through an argument. She marched straight toward me without hesitation, her sunglasses pushed up on her head and her arms swinging with that determined stride people have when they believe they're about to win something. I stood up slowly, brushing dirt off my jeans. She didn't even bother with a greeting. "Excuse me," she shouted. Her voice carried across the orchard like a siren. "What do you think you're doing here?" I blinked. Not exactly the kind of question you expect when you're watering trees on a quiet morning. I glanced around instinctively, almost like she might be talking to someone else. But no, she was staring directly at me. "I'm checking my
What
orchard."
is this? You got
I
my
said
car
slowly.
wet.
Hey, it was an
She
accident. I was
crossed
just
her arms
watering.
An accident? Look at the
Not
mess.
casually
All right, I'll
either.
fix it.
More like someone preparing to lecture a child. "Well, this land belongs to the HOA community.
We need to check the
behind
perimeter.
us," she
Something's
said
not right.
sharply.
Understood. I'll
"And you're
coordinate.
trespassing."
Ma'am, we'll handle
For
it.
a second, I just stared at her. Then I laughed. Not in a rude way. Just the kind of laugh that slips out when someone says something so unbelievably wrong that your brain takes a second to process it. Her expression tightened instantly. "Oh, you think this is funny?" I wiped my hands on my jeans. "I mean, a little, yeah." She stepped closer. Now that she was near enough for me to see clearly, she looked like the kind of person who took rules very seriously. Perfect hair, perfect clothes, not a wrinkle anywhere. Behind her, just past the line of trees, I could see the rooftops of the neighborhood she was talking about. Willow Creek Estates. It had popped up about 10 years ago when developers started buying land around the area. Suddenly, there were neat streets, identical houses, and those tall, decorative entrance signs that make every neighborhood sound like a luxury resort. Willow Creek Estates, the sign said proudly. I'd watched the entire thing get built from my porch. But the developers never bought my orchard. And that detail? Apparently nobody in that neighborhood knew it. She pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures of the trees. Click, click, click. What exactly are you doing? I asked. Documenting violations, she replied. Violations? Yes. These trees are far too tall for residential landscaping standards. I stared at her. They're peach trees. They are unapproved peach trees, she corrected. I couldn't help it. I laughed again. That clearly didn't help my situation. Her face turned red with frustration. You think this is a joke, don't you? No, I said calmly. I just think you might be confused. She took a step forward, pointing toward the neighborhood behind her. I'm the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, she said proudly. The way she said it sounded like she expected dramatic music to start playing. And as HOA president, she continued, it is my responsibility to enforce community property standards. I leaned slightly against the trunk of one of the trees. That's great, I said. Her eyes narrowed. So you'll be removing these trees immediately. Not a chance. The silence that followed felt like the calm before a thunderstorm. She blinked slowly. I beg your pardon? This is my orchard, I said. My family's owned it for decades. She smiled. Not a friendly smile either. The kind of smile people give when they're convinced they're about to prove you wrong. Oh, honey, she said. Yes, it is. She turned her phone around and pointed toward the neighborhood. This entire section of land belongs to the Willow Creek HOA. I shook my head. No, it doesn't. Her smile widened. Well, the police can sort that out. Before I could respond, she tapped her phone screen and lifted it to her ear. And just like that, she called the police on me for standing in my own orchard. And the craziest part, her name, at that moment, I later learned, she still had Linda. Absolutely no idea. Normally, I try not to judge people too quickly, or what land she was really the moment she started talking, you could just feel the energy she brought with her. The kind of energy that says, I'm used to telling people what to do, and I expect them to listen. And the moment she mentioned she was the president of the HOA, everything suddenly made a lot more sense. If you've ever lived near one of those neighborhoods, you already know the type. Behind my orchard sat a brand new suburban development called Willow Creek Estates. It had been built about 10 years earlier. What is this? You got my car wet.
Hey, it was an accident. I was just watering.
An accident? Look at the mess.
All right, I'll fix it. The place had been nothing but open countryside. But once construction started, everything changed.
We need to check the perimeter. Something's not right.
Understood. I'll coordinate. Ma'am,
big identical houses appeared one after another, like someone had copied and pasted them across the land. Every lawn was perfectly trimmed. Every driveway was spotless. Every mailbox looked exactly the same. And every house followed the same set of rules. Now, I didn't live in Willow Creek Estates. My house sat just outside the development, closer to the orchard my grandfather planted decades ago. But even from a distance, you could tell that neighborhood ran on rules. Rules about fence height. Rules about house paint colors. Rules about where you could park. Rules about how long your grass was allowed to grow. I once heard a guy got a warning letter because his garbage cans were visible from the street for too long. So yeah, they took their rules seriously. But apparently, Linda had decided those rules applied to my land too. She pulled out her phone and began walking around the edge of the orchard, snapping pictures like some kind of inspector documenting a crime scene. Click, click, click. Each picture was taken with dramatic seriousness. I stood there watching her, honestly a little confused about whether she was joking or not. This orchard is violating HOA landscaping regulations, she announced. I blinked. My orchard? Yes, she snapped, barely looking up from her phone. These trees are far too tall for residential landscaping standards. I looked up at the tree next to me. It was a peach tree, maybe 15 feet tall, the exact kind of tree you'd expect in, well, an orchard. Ma'am, I said slowly, they're supposed to be tall. She ignored that completely. And another thing, she continued, pacing along the rows of trees like she was giving a tour. These trees are attracting wildlife. I glanced around. A couple of birds chirped above us. A squirrel darted across a branch. You mean nature? I asked. She gave me a look that suggested I was intentionally missing the point. Wildlife can create serious issues for the community, she said firmly. The HOA board will not tolerate that. That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know about how seriously she took her position. The HOA board will not tolerate that. Like she was announcing some official decree. Now at this point, I was trying really hard to stay polite. There's no reason to escalate things with someone you've just met, especially when they're clearly already upset. So I kept my voice calm. "Ma'am," I said, "this land isn't part of your HOA." She finally stopped taking pictures. Slowly, she turned toward me, and then she smiled. Not a friendly smile. Not the kind of smile people give when they realize there's been a misunderstanding. No, this was the kind of smile people give when they're absolutely convinced they're about to correct someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. "Oh, honey," she said. That single phrase told me everything about how she viewed the situation. "Yes, it is." I shook my head. "No, it really isn't." Linda walked closer to the tree line and pointed toward the houses behind her. Rows of large two-story homes stretched across the land just beyond the orchard. Freshly painted walls, clean sidewalks, decorative street lamps. It looked like the kind of place you'd see in a real estate commercial. "That entire development," she said proudly, "belongs to Willow Creek Estates." "I know," I replied. "And this land," she continued, gesturing dramatically around the orchard, "is included in the community property
What
area."
is this? You got
I
my
folded
car
my
wet.
arms.
Hey, it was an accident. I was
According
just
to who?
watering.
An
According
accident?
to
Look
the
at the
HOA
mess.
property
All right, I'll
map,
fix it.
she said confidently. Now that part made me pause for a second. Not because she was right,
We need to check
but
the
because
perimeter.
she sounded
Something's not
so
right.
certain.
Understood.
Like
I'll
she had
coordinate.
repeated that
Ma'am,
fact
we'll handle it.
many times before. She slipped her phone back in her pocket and took another step closer, lowering her voice slightly, like she was explaining something obvious. "You see this happen all the time," she said. "People assume land is private just because it isn't developed yet." I nodded slowly. "Except this land is private." She sighed the way someone does when they're losing patience. "Look," she said, "I deal with this kind of thing regularly. Contractors, landscapers, temporary workers, people wander onto HOA property all the time." I couldn't help but laugh a little. "Temporary worker? Well, clearly you don't live here," she said. "I live right over there," I replied, pointing toward my small house just beyond the orchard. She turned to look at it. For the first time since arriving, she seemed slightly uncertain, but it only lasted a second. "Well, that doesn't matter," she said quickly. "The land itself is still HOA property." I shook my head again. "No, it really isn't." She placed her hands on her hips. "Sir," she said firmly, "I'm the president of the Homeowners Association. I know exactly where the property boundaries are." That confidence would have been impressive if it hadn't been completely wrong. "All right," I said calmly. "So, where exactly do you think the property line is?" She pointed directly at the row of peach trees behind me. "Right there." I followed her finger. Then I looked back at her. "That's interesting." "Why?" she asked. "Because according to the deed," I said, "the property line runs about 200 feet past your neighborhood." For the first time, she hesitated. Just slightly. But instead of reconsidering, she doubled down. "Well," she said sharply, "the police can sort that out." And with that, she reached for her phone again. Right then and there, standing at the edge of my grandfather's orchard, the president of Willow Creek's about 5 minutes after decided the best solution. Linda decided to do the most was to call the police on the guy who owned the land. She called the police, and somehow, not she still had absolutely not no as some idea empty threat how people big of a mistake when trying to scare someone. No, she actually dialed the number and stepped a few feet away, turning slightly so she could speak loudly enough for me to hear every word. I stood there holding the watering hose, listening as she dramatically explained the situation to the operator like she was reporting a serious crime. "Yes, hello," she said in a voice that sounded overly calm, the kind people use when they want to sound very official. "I'd like to report a trespasser on Willow Creek, HOA property." She paused for a moment, nodding to herself like the person on the other end could see her. "Yes, he's illegally farming the land." I raised an eyebrow. Illegally farming? That was a new one. Linda glanced over at me while she continued talking, clearly expecting me to look nervous or start packing up my things. But I didn't move. Instead, I went back to watering the tree I had been working on earlier, The steady stream of water soaked into the dirt while she continued her phone call. Yes, I'm the president of the Homeowners Association, she added proudly. I'm responsible for enforcing community property rules. Another pause. Yes, he's still here. She looked back at me again, this time with a smug little smile. Yes, he's pretending the orchard belongs to him. I almost laughed out loud. Pretending. That was the word she chose.
What is this? You got my car wet.
Hey, it was an accident. I was just watering.
An accident? Look at the mess.
All right, I'll
They'll
fix
be
it.
here shortly, she said confidently. I shrugged. All right. The fact that I wasn't panicking
We need to check the
seemed to
perimeter.
confuse
Something's
her a
not
little.
right.
She
Understood.
probably expected me to argue
Ma'am,
more,
we'll handle it.
or maybe try to leave before the police arrived. But why would I? I wasn't doing anything wrong, so I kept watering the trees. The sun had started climbing higher in the sky by then, warming the orchard and casting long shadows across the grass. A light breeze moved through the branches, rustling the leaves softly. Birds continued hopping from tree to tree like nothing unusual was happening. Meanwhile, Linda paced back and forth near the fence line like she was waiting for backup in a movie scene. Every now and then she'd glance at me, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe I was still there. At one point, she even pulled out her phone again and took a few more pictures. More evidence? I asked. Documentation, she replied sharply. For what? For the HOA records. I nodded slowly. Right. About 15 minutes later, the quiet morning was interrupted by the distant sound of a vehicle approaching. Soon a police cruiser turned down the dirt road and rolled to a stop near the orchard. Linda straightened immediately. You could practically see her confidence returning. Two officers stepped out of the car and looked around, clearly trying to understand what exactly they had been called out for. From their perspective, the scene probably looked pretty harmless. One guy standing near a bunch of fruit trees. One very determined woman pointing toward him. Not exactly a high-stakes emergency. One of the officers walked over to me, while the other stayed near Linda. Morning, the officer said. Morning, I replied. He glanced at the orchard, then back at me. Sir, we got a report that you're trespassing. I pointed casually toward the rows of trees around us. I own this land. Before I could say anything else, Linda practically rushed over to interrupt. No, he doesn't, she said loudly. The officer turned toward her. This is Willow Creek HOA property, she continued, pointing dramatically at the ground. He's been illegally farming here. The officer blinked. Illegally farming? Yes, she said firmly. These trees violate HOA landscaping regulations. The officer slowly looked around the orchard again. Then he looked back at me. You've been trespassing here? He asked carefully. I shook my head. No, sir. Then I gestured toward the trees. My family has owned this orchard for decades. Linda scoffed loudly behind him. That's not true. The second officer, who had been listening quietly, stepped a little closer. All right, he said calmly. Let's slow down for a second. He turned to Linda. Ma'am, you said you're with the Homeowners Association? I'm the president, she corrected proudly. Okay. Then he turned back to me. And you're saying you own this property? Yes. The officer nodded thoughtfully. This clearly wasn't the kind of call they deal with every day. Most trespassing situations are pretty simple. Someone is somewhere they shouldn't be. Police show up. Person leaves. End of story. But this situation was different, because both sides were claiming ownership of the same land. The officer rubbed the back of his neck slightly and sighed. All right, he said. Do either of you have proof? Linda opened her mouth immediately, but then she hesitated. I mean, I have the HOA community map, she said. Is it with you? The officer asked. Well, not physically. The officer nodded slowly. Then he looked at me. What about you, sir? I smiled a little.
What is this?
Actually,
you got my car wet.
Hey, it was an accident. I was just watering.
An accident? Look at the mess.
Linda
All right, I'll
folded
fix
her
it.
arms again, clearly expecting me to pull out something ridiculous. Go ahead, the officer
We need to check
said.
the perimeter.
I walked
Something's
over to my
not
truck,
right.
which was
Understood. I'll
parked near
coordinate.
the edge of the
Ma'am,
orchard.
we'll handle it.
Inside the glove compartment was a small folder I always kept there. The same folder my grandfather had given me years ago, the one containing something very important, and something that was about to make this entire situation extremely awkward for the HOA president standing behind me. I grabbed the folder and walked back toward the officers. Linda watched carefully, still looking completely confident that she was about to be proven right. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were several official documents, property records, land surveys, and most importantly, the original deed. I handed the paperwork to the officer. "Here you go," I said. He began looking through the documents carefully. The other officer stepped closer to glance over his shoulder. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Linda stood there tapping her foot impatiently. Finally, she broke the silence. "Well," she asked. The officer kept reading. Then he flipped to the next page. And the next. I walked back to my truck. His expression slowly shifted from neutral. It wasn't anything to slightly confused. Just an old brown folder with worn corners. Back down at the papers again. Crease. And that's when the entire situation started to take a very unexpected turn. Most people probably wouldn't think twice about something like that sitting in a glove compartment. But inside that folder was something extremely important. Something my grandfather had handed to me years ago. The original land deed. I still remember the day he gave it to me. We were sitting on the porch of a small farmhouse that overlooked the orchard. The sun was setting behind the rows of peach trees, and the entire place smelled like summer fruit and warm dirt. He handed me the folder and said something simple that stuck with me ever since. Land is one of the few things in life that can't be replaced. If you're lucky enough to own it, protect it. At the time, I nodded like I understood the weight of those words. But truthfully, I didn't fully appreciate what he meant until years later. Especially not until that morning. I walked back toward the two officers standing near the trees. Linda watched me closely the entire time, her arms folded and her posture stiff with confidence. You could tell she was absolutely certain that whatever I was about to show them wouldn't matter. From her perspective, the situation was already settled. She was the HOA president. She believed the neighborhood owned the land. And therefore, in her mind, I had to be wrong. When I reached the officers, I opened the folder and carefully pulled out the documents inside. The pages were slightly yellowed with age, but the text was still clear. Official stamps, legal signatures, survey maps, all the things that turn a piece of land into documented property. I handed the paperwork to the officer who had asked for proof. "Here you go," I said. He took the papers and began flipping through them slowly. The second officer leaned over beside him, glancing at the pages as they turned. Meanwhile, Linda stood just a few feet away, watching the entire process like someone waiting for a referee to confirm a call in a game she was sure she had already won. At first, the officer's face showed nothing, just a calm, professional expression. He turned one page, then another, then another. Each page contained the official property descriptions. Long lines of legal language describing boundary points, measurements, landmarks, and survey coordinates. If you've never read one of those documents before,
what is this? You got my car wet.
Hey, it was an accident. I was just watering.
An accident? Look at the mess.
All right, I'll fix it.
The officer flipped forward again. Eventually, he reached the most important part.
We need to check the perimeter. Something's not right.
Understood. I'll coordinate.
Showing the entire property
handle
layout. Every acre was outlined clearly, with the orchard marked right near the center. He studied the map for several seconds. Then he leaned slightly closer. The second officer stepped nearer as well, reading over his shoulder. A small crease formed on the first officer's forehead. He flipped the page back once, then forward again. Linda finally broke the silence. "Well?" she asked impatiently. The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up at me, then over at Linda, then back down at the papers again. Finally, he spoke. "Well," he said slowly, "he definitely owns the orchard." For a moment, everything went completely quiet. Linda's confident smile vanished like someone had flipped a switch. "What?" she said. The officer lifted the papers slightly. "The deed shows this property belongs to him." Linda blinked rapidly. "But that's impossible." She stepped closer and reached for the folder, grabbing it from the officer so she could look at the pages herself. "No," she said while flipping through the documents quickly. "That can't be right." I leaned casually against one of the nearby peach trees while she read. "Take your time," I said. She scanned through the first page, then the second. Her movements slowed slightly. Her eyebrows pulled together as she continued reading. "This document is old," she said finally. "Yes," I replied calmly. "It is. That doesn't mean it's still valid." The officer shook his head slightly. "Property deeds don't just expire," he explained. She frowned. Well, maybe the developers updated the boundaries when they built Willow Creek Estates. That would have made sense. Except for one important detail. They hadn't. Because when the developers came to this area about 10 years ago, they were buying up land all around the countryside to build their new suburban community. Large sections of farmland changed hands during that time. But my grandfather had refused to sell the orchard. He had said something I still remember clearly. Developers build houses. Trees build history. So instead of selling, he kept the land exactly as it was. The developers bought everything around it. But the orchard stayed. Linda continued scanning through the pages like she was searching for a sentence that would magically prove her right. The officer gently pointed toward the survey map. According to this, he said, the orchard falls completely inside his property boundary. Linda stared down at the map. But the HOA property map shows this as community space, she insisted. Do you have that map with you? The officer asked. She hesitated. Well, no. Then we have to rely on the legal documents available. She looked irritated by that answer. But the neighborhood has been here for 10 years. The officer nodded. And the deed shows the land has been owned by his family for 60. Linda didn't say anything for a few seconds. She just stared at the papers like they had personally betrayed her. Finally, she handed the folder back to the officer. This still doesn't make sense, she muttered. The officer flipped back to the survey map again. He studied it more closely this time. Then his eyebrows slowly lifted. Actually, he said, both Linda and I looked at him. There's something else here. He tapped a finger lightly on the page. You said your neighborhood is Willow Creek Estates, right? Yes, Linda replied cautiously. And it's directly behind this
You got my car
orchard.
wet.
Hey, it was an accident.
Yes.
I was just watering.
He nodded.
An accident?
Then
Look
he
at
traced
the mess.
a long
All right, I'll
boundary
fix it.
line across the map. Well, according to this survey, he paused. The property lines
We need to
extend
check the
quite a
perimeter.
bit
Something's
farther
not
than
right.
just the orchard.
Understood. I'll coordinate.
Linda frowned.
Ma'am, we'll handle
What do you
it.
mean? The officer rotated the map slightly so she could see it more clearly. He pointed toward a large section of land beyond the trees. Land that stretched directly into the area where the neighborhood had been built. This boundary line here, he said, continues past the orchard. Linda leaned closer. And it runs right under part of Willow Creek Estates. The words hung in the air for a moment. Linda blinked. That's not possible. The officer shrugged. It's what the survey shows. She stared at the map again. Then she shook her head firmly. No, that has to be wrong. I pushed myself off the tree and stepped a little closer. Actually, I said calmly, that part is correct. She turned toward me slowly. What are you talking about? I pointed toward the map. When the developers built Willow Creek Estates, they didn't buy all the land. Her eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means they bought building rights for part of the area. But the land itself stayed in our family. Linda's face went pale. The officer nodded slightly. That kind of arrangement happens sometimes, he said. It means the homes can be built there, but the land ownership remains separate. The officer kept flipping through the documents. At first, it seemed routine. Just another officer reviewing paperwork during a property dispute. His fingers moved slowly from one page to the next, scanning lines of legal text that described property boundaries, ownership history, and survey measurements. The second officer leaned slightly closer, occasionally glancing down at the papers as well. Meanwhile, Linda stood nearby with her arms crossed, clearly expecting the process to end quickly. From her point of view, this whole thing was just a minor inconvenience. She believed the outcome was already obvious. The police would confirm the land belonged to the HOA, I would be told to leave, and she would walk away feeling like she had successfully enforced community rules. She even had that confident posture people get when they believe they're about to be proven right. But the longer the officer looked at the paperwork, the more his expression changed. First he looked neutral, then thoughtful, then slightly puzzled. He flipped another page, then another. The rustling of paper was the only sound for a few moments, aside from the gentle breeze moving through the peach trees above us. Finally, he reached a larger folded sheet inside the folder. He paused. Wait a second, he muttered. That one sentence immediately caught everyone's attention. The second officer leaned closer. What is it? He asked quietly. Instead of answering right away, the first officer carefully pulled the folded paper out of the folder and opened it. It was the official land survey map attached to the property deed. Unlike the other pages, which were filled with paragraphs of legal descriptions, this one was a detailed diagram showing the entire property layout. Survey maps are designed to remove confusion. They show exactly where a property begins and ends. Every boundary line, every corner marker, every measurement down to the foot. The officer held the map out carefully, unfolding it fully so the entire diagram could be seen. The paper was large enough that it almost looked like a blueprint. His eyes moved slowly across the map. Then his eyebrows lifted, not slightly, noticeably, the kind of reaction people have when they suddenly realize
What is this?
something
You got my
unexpected.
car wet.
Hey, it was an
Ma'am, he
accident.
said.
I was just watering.
Linda
An
straightened
accident? Look at the
immediately.
mess.
All right, I'll
You might
fix
want to
it.
see this. She stepped closer, her confidence returning slightly. She probably
We need to check
assumed
the perimeter.
officer had
Something's
found
not
something
right.
that supported
Understood.
her
I'll
claim.
coordinate.
Maybe she
Ma'am,
expected
we'll
the
handle it.
map to show the orchard clearly inside HOA property lines. Yes, she said. The officer angled the map toward her. Then he pointed to a section near the middle. This area here, he said, tapping the page lightly, is the orchard. Linda nodded quickly. Yes, that's the land I was referring to. But the officer didn't move his finger away. Instead, he slowly traced one of the thick boundary lines that ran along the edge of the orchard. Now, if you follow this line, he continued. His finger moved past the row of trees drawn on the diagram, then past a small road marking, then farther. Linda leaned closer to the map. What about it? She asked. The officer didn't answer immediately. He simply kept tracing the line. And that's when the situation started becoming very interesting. Because if you looked carefully, the orchard wasn't the only thing outlined in that deed. The property lines extended much farther than just those rows of peach trees. Farther than most people would assume. Past the orchard, past the dirt road running along its edge, past a small stretch of open field. And then the line kept going, right toward the section of land where the neighborhood stood. Linda's eyes followed the line. At first, she didn't react. Then her forehead wrinkled slightly. What is that area? She asked. The officer looked at the map again. That appears to be residential lots. Linda frowned. That's Willow Creek Estates. The officer nodded slowly. That's what it looks like. For a moment, nobody said anything. Linda leaned closer, squinting at the map like she might have misread it. No, she said. That can't be right. The officer traced the boundary again, carefully pointing out the measurements printed along the line. Every section was labeled with exact distances. 200 feet, 400 feet, 600 feet. The line continued clearly past the orchard and into the development area. He looked up. According to this survey, he said calmly, the property boundaries extend well beyond the orchard. Linda stared at him. What do you mean? The officer tapped the map again. This boundary line continues past the trees. His finger slid across the paper, past the road, then farther, and into this section right here. Linda followed his finger again. Her expression slowly shifted from confusion to disbelief. That's the neighborhood, she said. Yes, the officer replied. But according to this map, it falls inside the same property boundary. For a second, Linda just stared at the paper, like it was written in another language. That can't be right. But the map was very clear. The boundary lines were drawn with thick ink. Corner markers were labeled. Coordinates were printed next to each turn in the line. It wasn't a rough sketch. It was an official survey created when the land was first purchased decades ago. Linda looked up at me slowly. You're saying this land goes under the neighborhood? I shrugged. Technically speaking, yes. Her mouth opened slightly. That's impossible. The second officer leaned closer to the map now. Actually, he said, it's not that unusual. Linda looked at him. What do you mean? Sometimes developers purchase building rights instead of full land ownership, he explained. It allows construction while the original land title
What is this? You
remains
got my
with the
car
property
wet.
owner.
Hey, it was an accident.
Linda
I was just
blinked.
watering.
An
But this is an
accident? Look at the
entire
mess.
All right, I'll
subdivision.
fix it.
The officer nodded, which means someone probably signed a long-term agreement. She looked back down
We
at
need
the
to
map
check the
again.
perimeter.
Her
Something's
fingers
not
slowly
right.
traced
Understood.
the
I'll
boundary
coordinate.
lines
Ma'am,
once more.
we'll handle it.
The orchard, the field, the road, the neighborhood, everything connected into one large property outline. Suddenly the confidence she had earlier that morning was completely gone. "So, you're telling me," she said slowly. She pointed toward the houses visible just beyond the trees. "Those homes are sitting on his property?" I leaned slightly against the trunk of the nearest peach tree. "Looks that way." Linda shook her head. "No, no way." She pointed toward the neighborhood again. "The HOA owns that land. Owns the houses," I corrected. "Not necessarily the ground under them." She looked like she was trying to process that idea and failing. "But the developers built the entire community." "Yes. So they had to own the land." "Not always." The officer folded the map slightly and pointed a note printed along the edge of the diagram. "This survey indicates a long-term development agreement," he said. Linda stared at the note. "And that means—" "It means the landowner allowed construction without transferring ownership." She slowly turned toward me. "You're serious?" I nodded. "My grandfather made the agreement years ago." Her face went pale. "And nobody in the HOA knew about this?" I shrugged. "Apparently not." She turned back toward the neighborhood again. Rows of large houses sat peacefully in the morning sunlight. But now there was one rule nobody had expected. The ground beneath those homes, the kind of place where technically part of my family's property, was carefully enforced. Linda looked back at the officers. "This has to be some kind of mistake." The first officer shook his head slightly. "The documents look legitimate, but the HOA manages the entire neighborhood." "That doesn't necessarily mean they own the land," he replied. She stood there silently for several seconds. Then she looked at me again. "You're telling me," her voice was quieter now, "that this entire time," she gestured toward the neighborhood behind her, "we've been sitting on land that belongs to you?" I gave a small shrug. "According to the deed, yes." The realization slowly spread across her face. She hadn't just called the police on a trespasser. She had called the police on the actual landowner. And if the survey map was correct, she had been standing in his orchard the entire time, accusing him of breaking rules that didn't even apply to him. The officer carefully folded the survey map and placed it back inside the folder. "Well," he said calmly, "based on these documents, he definitely owns the orchard." Linda didn't respond. She was still staring toward the neighborhood, because for the first time since she marched across the field that morning, she realized something. This situation wasn't going the way she expected, not even close. And if the rest of the documents said what the survey map suggested, then the biggest surprise was still yet to come. Here's the part the developers never expected anyone to notice. And honestly, for a long time, most people didn't. Not the homeowners, not the HOA board, and apparently not even the HOA president who had just called the police on me. The truth was buried in old paperwork, survey maps, and a development agreement signed decades ago. The kind of document people forget about once houses are built and neighborhoods start running normally. But that morning, standing in the middle of my orchard with two police officers and an increasingly confused
What is this? You
HOA
got my car
president,
wet.
Hey, it was an
that
accident.
truth
I was just
finally
watering.
started
An
coming out.
accident? Look at the
When
mess.
Willow Creek
All right, I'll
Estates
fix
was
it.
built about 10 years ago, the developers came into the area looking for large pieces
We
of
need
land
to check the
they
perimeter.
could turn into a
Something's not
suburban
right.
neighborhood.
Understood. I'll
Back
coordinate.
then,
Ma'am,
most of the
we'll handle
surrounding
it.
farmland had already been sold off. Several property owners took the opportunity to sell their land for a good price once development started expanding outside the city. But my grandfather was different. He loved that orchard. To him, those trees weren't just crops. They were memories. They were something he had spent decades building with his own hands. So when the developers approached him with an offer to buy the land, he turned them down. At least, he turned down the first offer. But the developers were persistent. They came back again later with a different proposal. Instead of buying the property outright, they suggested a development agreement, an arrangement that allowed them to build homes on part of the land while my grandfather kept legal ownership of it. At the time, it probably sounded like a good compromise. The developers could expand their neighborhood, and my grandfather could keep the orchard and the surrounding land that meant so much to him. So they worked out a long-term agreement. The developers were granted building rights to construct homes and roads across a specific portion of the land. But the actual land ownership stayed exactly where it had always been, with my family. That meant one very important thing. The houses belonged to the homeowners, but the land beneath them technically didn't. It still belonged to us. Now, agreements like that aren't incredibly common, but they're not unheard of either. Sometimes landowners lease property for development while retaining ownership of the ground itself. Most people living in the neighborhood probably never even realized that detail. They bought their homes. They moved in. They paid HOA dues. And life continued like normal. But hidden deep in the property records was the original deed and survey map that still showed the land boundaries exactly as they had been when my grandfather first purchased the property decades earlier. And those boundaries were very clear. They included the orchard, the field beside it, the road, and a large section of land that now happened to contain Willow Creek Estates. The officer studying the documents had already noticed it. Now it was time for Linda to fully understand what it meant. He held the folder open and looked over at her. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "according to this deed, the homeowner here owns the land beneath the development." Linda stared at him. Her face looked completely blank for a moment, like her brain was trying to reboot. "What?" she said. The officer pointed down at the survey map again. "This property line runs directly through the neighborhood." Linda leaned closer to the paper. Her eyes moved slowly along the boundary lines. First the orchard, then the road, then the rows of rectangular lots representing houses, each one sitting neatly inside the same property outline. Her mouth opened slightly. "That doesn't make sense." The second officer spoke up. "Looks like the developers had construction rights, but not full land ownership." Linda blinked rapidly. But the HOA manages the entire neighborhood." The officer nodded. "That doesn't necessarily mean the HOA owns the land." She looked from the officer to me, then back to the map again. "So you're saying?" Her voice sounded uncertain now. "That he owns the ground under those houses?" I gave a small shrug. "According to the deed, yes." Linda took a step back like the ground itself had just shifted beneath her feet. "But that would mean—"
What
She
is this?
turned
You got
and
my
looked
car
toward the
wet.
neighborhood.
Hey, it was an accident.
Rows
I was
of
just
houses
watering.
An
stood
accident? Look at the
quietly in
mess.
All right, I'll
distance.
fix it.
Perfectly maintained lawns, driveways lined with cars, kids' bicycles resting
We need to
near
check the
sidewalks.
perimeter. Something's
A
not
typical
right.
peaceful
Understood. I'll coordinate.
suburban community.
Ma'am, we'll handle it.
Except now Linda was realizing something she had never considered before. All of it was technically sitting on land my family owned. She turned back toward the officer again. "So, he's not trespassing?" she asked slowly. The officer chuckled a little. "No, ma'am." He gestured toward the orchard. "This land belongs to him." Linda's shoulders slumped slightly. The confidence she had shown earlier that morning was completely gone. And then the officer added the one sentence that ended the entire argument. "If anything," he paused for a moment. "You might be." The silence that followed was almost painful. Linda looked down at the ground, then around at the orchard, then back at the houses behind her. For the first time since she had stormed across the field yelling at me, she looked unsure of herself. "Well," she said awkwardly, "I was just trying to enforce HOA regulations." I nodded. "I get that." She shifted uncomfortably. "But if this land belongs to you, then HOA rules don't apply here." I finished. The officer nodded. "That's correct." Linda rubbed her forehead slightly, clearly trying to process the situation. "This is very confusing. Property agreements can get complicated," the officer said. She sighed. "I just thought this area was part of the community property." "That's a pretty common assumption, especially if nobody ever looked at the original documents." Linda looked back at the orchard again. The same trees she had been accusing of violating HOA landscaping rules just 20 minutes earlier. Now, they looked a lot less like a problem, and a lot more like someone else's private land. "I guess I should have checked the records first," she admitted quietly. The officer closed the folder and handed it back to me. "Well," he said, "it looks like everything here is in order." I nodded and tucked the documents back into the folder. "Thanks for checking." The second officer glanced around the orchard one last time. "Nice place you've got here," he said. "Thank you." Linda stood silently for a moment. Then she cleared her throat. "Well, I suppose there's been a misunderstanding." I smiled slightly. "Seems that way." She hesitated like she wanted to say something else. But instead, she simply turned and began walking back toward her SUV. The officers followed shortly after, heading toward their patrol car parked near the road. Before getting in, One of them looked back toward me. "Have a good day," he said. "You too." The cruiser started up and slowly drove away. Linda's SUV pulled out a few seconds later and disappeared down the road toward Willow Creek Estates. And just like that, the orchard was quiet again. The birds were still chirping. The trees were still swaying gently in the breeze. And the same peaceful morning I had started with slowly returned. But something had definitely changed, because somewhere inside Willow Creek Estates, the HOA president had just discovered a piece of information that was going to make the next board meeting extremely interesting. The entire neighborhood believed they controlled everything around them. But now there was one very important fact they couldn't ignore anymore. The land beneath their perfectly organized community wasn't actually theirs. It didn't take long for the story to spread. In fact, within a week, the entire neighborhood knew about it. What started as a small argument in my orchard
What is
quickly
this? You got
turned
my
into the
car wet.
biggest
Hey, it
topic
was an
of
accident. I was just
conversation
watering.
inside
An
Willow
accident?
Creek
Look at the
Estates.
mess.
All right,
At
I'll
first,
fix it.
It spread the way most neighborhood gossip does, quietly. One person tells a neighbor.
We need to
That
check
neighbor
the
tells someone
perimeter.
else.
Something's not
Then
right.
someone mentions
Understood.
it while
I'll coordinate.
walking their dog.
Ma'am, we'll handle
Before
it.
long, the whole community is talking about the same thing. Except this wasn't some small rumor about noisy neighbors or someone painting their fence the wrong color. This was something much bigger, because apparently the HOA board had never actually checked the original land agreements when the neighborhood was built. For years, everyone simply assumed the HOA owned the entire area. The roads, the green spaces, the empty land around the houses, and, of course, the orchard. But once Linda's confrontation with me became public knowledge, people started asking questions. And those questions spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the middle of the week, homeowners were already knocking on each other's doors, trying to figure out what was really going on. Some people were confused. Some people were worried. And a few were downright panicked. I didn't even have to go into the neighborhood to hear about it. Word started reaching me through the people who lived nearby. Apparently, conversations in Willow Creek Estates sounded something like this. Wait, do we actually own our yards? Who owns the roads? Are we renting the land? Is the HOA lying to us? Can that guy kick us out? Now, of course, none of that was exactly how the agreement worked. But when people hear that the ground under their house might technically belong to someone else, their imagination starts running pretty fast. Within a few days, the entire HOA board had realized they had a serious problem on their hands, which meant Linda had to respond. So she did the one thing HOA presidents usually do when chaos breaks out. She scheduled an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers went up around the neighborhood. Emails were sent out. Messages appeared on the community website. The announcement read something like, "Emergency community meeting regarding property documentation." But by the time that meeting was scheduled, it was already too late to control the narrative, because the story had already traveled far beyond the HOA board. People were talking about it at the community park, at the mailbox stations, while walking their dogs in the evening. And the version of the story that kept spreading was much simpler than the legal explanation. It went something like this. The guy with the orchard actually owns the land under the entire neighborhood. Now, technically, that wasn't exactly accurate. But once rumors start spreading, accuracy usually takes a back seat. And that's when something unexpected started happening. Instead of people coming to the orchard to argue with me, they started coming to apologize. The first person showed up on a Wednesday afternoon. I was out trimming branches when I heard someone walking down the dirt road. When I looked up, a middle-aged man was approaching with his hands in his pockets. He looked a little nervous. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied. He stopped near the fence line and glanced around the orchard. "Nice place you got here." "Thanks." He shifted awkwardly. "So, I live in Willow Creek Estates." "I figured," I said with a small smile. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Listen, about what happened with Linda the other day." I raised an eyebrow. "What about it?" "Well, a lot of us heard what happened." He paused, and I just wanted to say sorry. I blinked. "Sorry." "Yeah," he said. "The HOA can get a little intense sometimes." I laughed a little. "That's one way to describe it." He nodded. "Most of us had no idea about the land agreement." "Doesn't surprise me." He looked back toward the neighborhood.
What is
behind
this? You
him.
got my car
Things are
wet.
pretty
Hey, it was
chaotic
an
over
accident.
there
I was
right
just
now.
An
watering.
Really?
accident? Look
Oh,
at the mess.
He shook
All right,
his
I'll
head.
fix it.
People are freaking out. "What about?" "Well," he hesitated. Some folks think you're going to
We
start
need to check the
charging
perimeter.
rent. That
Something's
made me
not
laugh
right.
out loud.
Understood. I'll coordinate.
Rent.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
we'll handle
He
it.
shrugged. You'd be surprised how fast rumors spread in a place like that. Just then he reached into the bag he was carrying. Oh, and my wife sent these. He handed me a small container. Inside were homemade chocolate chip cookies. I looked at them for a moment, then back at him. She said to tell you, please don't raise the rent on the dirt under our house. I couldn't stop laughing. Well, I said, tell your wife not to worry. He smiled. I'll let her know. And that was just the beginning. Over the next few days, more neighbors started showing up near the orchard. Some of them came while walking their dogs. Some came while jogging down the road. Others just drove by slowly and waved. Almost every conversation started the same way. Hey, are you the orchard guy? Yep. Just wanted to say sorry about the whole HOA situation. It turns out a lot of the homeowners weren't big fans of the HOA leadership either. They followed the rules because they had to, but many of them quietly found the constant regulations annoying. So when the story spread that the HOA president had accidentally called the police on the actual landowner, people found it pretty funny. One afternoon, a young couple came by pushing a stroller. We heard what happened, the husband said. Pretty wild story. The wife nodded. Honestly, Linda has been sending warning letters about mailbox colors for years. I smiled. Well, she's definitely dedicated to the rules. They laughed. But calling the cops on the landowner? The husband said. That's a new one. Meanwhile, back inside the neighborhood, things were getting messy. The emergency HOA meeting apparently turned into complete chaos. Neighbors packed into the community center demanding answers. People were asking the board members question after question. Why didn't anyone check the property records? How long has this agreement existed? Does this affect our mortgages? What happens if the landowner changes his mind? The board didn't have many clear answers, because until that week, most of them hadn't even looked at the original development documents. And Linda? Well, she was having a particularly rough time. The story about her confrontation in the orchard had spread faster than anything else. By the time the meeting happened, half the neighborhood already knew she had called the police on the guy who technically owned the land. That kind of thing doesn't exactly boost your credibility as an HOA president. After the meeting, something else interesting happened. Linda stopped coming anywhere near the orchard. Not once. Before that day, she used to drive by occasionally while doing neighborhood inspections. But after the police incident, her SUV never appeared near the dirt road again. Neighbors told me she had become very quiet at HOA gatherings. Apparently, she wasn't enjoying being the center of the community's biggest story. Meanwhile, life in the orchard returned to normal. The trees kept growing. Birds kept nesting in the branches. And every now and then, someone from Willow Creek Estates would walk by and wave. No complaints. No arguments. Just the occasional joke about rent and property lines. And honestly, the cookies weren't bad either. About a month passed after the whole situation in the orchard. By then, the chaos inside Willow Creek Estates had slowly started to settle down. The rumors had calmed. The HOA board had spent several weeks digging through old property records, and most of the homeowners had finally realized that the situation
What is this? You got my
wasn't
car
quite
wet.
as
Hey, it was an
dramatic
accident.
as the
I was just
neighborhood
watering.
gossip had
An
made it
accident?
sound.
Look at the mess.
Still,
All right, I'll
the
fix it.
story hadn't completely disappeared. Every once in a while, someone walking past the orchard would stop.
We need to
and say
check the
something like,
perimeter.
"Hey, you're the guy
Something's
from the
not right."
HOA story,
Understood.
right?"
I'll coordinate.
I just smile and
We'll
nod.
handle it.
Life had mostly gone back to normal for me. Every morning, I'd walk the rows of peach trees the same way I always had. The orchard was peaceful again. The branches were starting to fill with fruit as the season moved along, and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind replaced the loud voices that had echoed through the place a few weeks earlier. The birds were back. Squirrels jumped between branches, and the smell of ripening peaches slowly filled the air again. Honestly, if you ignored the occasional curious neighbor walking past the fence line, you'd never know anything dramatic had happened there at all. Then one afternoon, while I was sorting tools in the shed, I noticed something sticking out of my mailbox. It was a letter. The envelope had a neat printed label on the front. Willow Creek Estates, Homeowners Association. I paused for a moment. A small part of me expected the letter to contain something ridiculous. Maybe another complaint. Maybe some strange attempt to argue about the trees again. After all, HOA boards don't usually like admitting they were wrong. But when I opened the envelope and unfolded the paper inside, I was surprised. Because it wasn't a complaint. It wasn't a fine. And it definitely wasn't another warning about landscaping rules. It was an official apology. The letter was short but very formal. It explained that the HOA board had completed a full review of the neighborhood's original development documents and property records. During that review, they had confirmed exactly what the police officers had already seen in my deed and survey map. The land boundaries were real. The orchard was not part of the HOA, and the original development agreement did indeed show that portions of the neighborhood had been built under construction rights rather than full land transfer. In other words, my family's ownership of the land was completely legitimate. The letter went on to apologize for any inconvenience or misunderstanding caused by the earlier incident. It also stated that the HOA board would no longer attempt to enforce community regulations on any part of the orchard property. I read through the letter twice just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. Then I folded it back up and laughed. Not in a mean way, just the kind of laugh that happens when a strange situation finally wraps itself up in a neat ending. Later that week, one of the neighbors who had stopped by a few times walked over again while I was checking the irrigation system. "You get the letter?" he asked. I nodded. "Yep." He grinned. "They sent copies to the whole neighborhood, too." "Really?" "Oh, yeah." Apparently, the HOA had decided it was better to clear up the confusion publicly rather than let rumors keep spreading. So the apology had been included in the community newsletter that went out to every homeowner in Willow Creek Estates. That meant everyone in the neighborhood now officially knew the full story. The orchard belonged to me, and the HOA had overstepped. The neighbor leaned against the fence and chuckled. "You should have seen the last HOA meeting," he said. "Oh, it was interesting. Let me guess," I said. "Lots of awkward conversations." He laughed. "That's putting it lightly." Apparently, the board members had spent most of the meeting explaining how the property agreements worked and reassuring homeowners that nobody was about to lose their house. And during that meeting, something else had happened too. Linda had stepped down as HOA president. According to the neighbor, she didn't make a dramatic
What
speech
is this? You
or
got my
anything
car
like that.
wet.
Hey, it was an
She
accident.
simply
I was just
announced that
watering.
she would
An
be
accident?
resigning
Look at
from
the
her
mess.
position
All right,
and
I'll fix
allowing
it.
someone else to take over. Given everything that had happened, that decision probably wasn't surprising.
We need to check the perimeter.
After all,
Something's not
it's hard
right.
to keep
Understood. I'll
authority
coordinate.
as the head
Ma'am,
of an
we'll handle
HOA
it.
when the entire neighborhood knows you accidentally called the police on the actual landowner. The neighbor shrugged. "Honestly, I think most people were just relieved the whole thing was over." "Same here," I said. He nodded toward the orchard. "Well, at least the trees survived the HOA inspection." "Barely," I joked. We both laughed. After that, life continued the way it had before the incident. The orchard remained quiet and peaceful. Every morning, I walked the same rows of trees my grandfather had planted decades earlier. I trimmed branches, checked the soil, picked fruit when it was ready. Sometimes I'd pause near the edge of the property and look out toward Willow Creek Estates. From a distance, the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always had. Perfect lawns, clean streets, kids riding bikes along the sidewalks. Nothing about it suggested the kind of chaos that had happened a month earlier. But the people living there definitely remembered, because every once in a while, someone from the neighborhood would walk past the orchard while exercising or walking their dog. And instead of complaining about trees or asking questions about property lines, they'd simply wave. Sometimes they'd even stop to chat for a minute. One older woman who lived near the entrance of a neighborhood stopped by during peach season. "I heard you're selling fruit again this year," she said. "Of course," I replied. She smiled. "Well, if the landowner approves, I'd love to buy a basket." I laughed. Pretty sure the landowner is okay with that. A few days later, a group of kids from the neighborhood came by with their parents and bought peaches straight from the orchard. They ran between the trees laughing, completely unaware of the strange legal situation surrounding the land beneath their houses. And honestly, that was probably the best outcome possible, because despite the confusion and the drama, nobody actually wanted conflict. People just wanted to live peacefully in their homes. And I want to keep taking care of the orchard my grandfather had started all those years ago. So in the end, everything worked out. The HOA learned to double-check property records before making accusations. The neighbors gained a funny story they'd probably tell for years. And the orchard kept growing quietly, just like it always had. These days, mornings in the orchard are peaceful again. Birds chirp in the branches. Peaches ripen in the summer sun. And every once in a while, someone from Willow Creek Estates walks past the fence and waves politely. No complaints, no threats, no police calls, just quiet respect. Because now everyone in that neighborhood remembers one very important thing. The next time you try to control someone else's land, you might want to make absolutely sure you don't live on it.